start button here. Right, the art of the Counter-Reformation period. This is the period when the Catholic Church is redefining itself, if you will, sort of finding its core principles in answer to the Protestant Reformation. Right? They said we're bad. They said they're going to do this, but what are we really? Let's us define ourselves rather than the outsiders. And one of the things that they came up and said was that with religious art, it had to be accurate, right? It had to be realistic and legible, realistic, and it should engage you, right? The viewer should feel really a part of it to become more pious. And this spilled over into non-religious works as well, right? So what happened is that the Baroque, while it's a term that sort of means the longer 17th century, right? Things don't start in 1600, right? 1590s, 1580s, all the way to sort of 1710, 1720, Baroque, right? But what it came to mean is this art that is incredibly dramatic. Everywhere we look, whether we're talking about religious works or non-religious works, there's a sense of heightening the drama and the way in which it engages with you as a viewer, right? Whether it means that it wants you to be proactive as a viewer and move around the work, or whether it seems like it offers you things in the same way it offers people in the picture things. So we've seen numerous images of violin necks, unplayed violins extended toward you. Our water carrier of Seville, arguably that jug that's in the foreground, the closest thing to us, it's almost as if it's right there, and almost like he wants you to take it as well. And participate in this scene. That participatory nature of Baroque art is really a strong element of it that really sets it apart from almost everything we've seen up to this point. Is that idea of the extreme close-ups, right? That come right into your space, that figures that seem to reach out toward us. Diagonals that move into the canvas that sort of invite us in with it. These, and not just perspective, right? But these strong sort of foreshortenings in and out. All of these things are intended to engage us with the scene. And we talked about sort of the artist's attempt to engage your other senses, right? Not just visual. When you look at the picture, you don't just see it, you kind of hear it, you smell it, you touch it. Or at least you can imagine these things, right? I don't think that Velázquez wants you to walk up and rub your hands on the picture, and certainly no museum curator wants you to do that, right? But we saw that with Ribera. There's a sense of the skin being very, very palpable looking, and you can understand how it would feel to the touch. And with Velázquez, he's really focusing on these different surface qualities, whether it's the clothing and the wool versus the linen, versus the starchy cotton of the boy, or the face of the waterseller versus the old ruddy sunburned face of the waterseller versus the soft skin of the boy, or goodness knows all of these vessels in the foreground, handled so well, right? I mean, the glass has that frost on the outside of it. When cool water hits glass on a hot day and it just frosts up on the outside, it makes you want to have a beer, and the jugs that he's using to transport the water, he carries it in this big unglazed jug, transfers it to the glazed pottery here for them to keep, and they will then decant it into the glass, probably using the porcelain mug. But everything with a different surface texture. Velázquez capturing those different textures. Right? And that's, again, that idea of it's appealing to your senses. And how does that fit with the Counter-Reformation? How does that fit with, it's part of the Baroque. But I think it comes out of the Counter-Reformation because we talked about, when we looked at Bernini, how St. Ignatius Loyola, the leader of the Jesuit movement, really wanted people to practice a form of devotion that was proactive and engaged and use all of their senses to imagine themselves really there, right? As if they could hear and smell and feel what they're reading about. And thus it wouldn't stay on the page anymore. It become part of their lives. And so when we looked at Il Gesù, we saw this the ceiling just looks like it comes down and invades our space because we're part of it. And that transcends religious pictures. I mean, it's picked up in genre scenes, in scenes of everyday life that have nothing to do with religion, but have that same sense of trying to engage with you through appealing to all of your different senses, right? So we were looking at some of the details, which are quite lovely in this picture, and comparing the different surface qualities, and even just little things. Every time I see this, I see something I hadn't seen before. That the water that's around the foot of that jug and beat it up and caught the light on the table, right on this wooden table. It's really just what a terrific eye. And Velázquez is like 18 or 19 years old when he paints this. It's just like, geez, give it up, There's no chance you're ever going to be any good, at least not compared to him. And then I've always been struck by the water dripping down the side of this jug and how you can see where it's shiny from the water versus matte from the unglazed pottery. Now, it is a genre scene, and when we talked about genre scenes before, we talked about the fact that they have meaning, right? We talked about the fact that they come with some sort of allegorical content, a moralizing message, right? And with the money changer and his wife, it's sort of like, there's nothing wrong with money, but don't pretend you're holy if you're mostly interested in the cash, right? She's pretending to read her Bible. That's the problem, right? She's pretending to be spiritual when in fact she really cares more about the money and the scales than she does about Mary and Jesus in her book, right? And there's a guy in the mirror, looks a lot like Van Eyck in the mirror, right? And he's got a prayer book and he's doing it right. He's not distracted. Sophie.
I was just about to ask who that was in the mirror.
Yeah. Did I not cover that in the online? I couldn't remember in the online. I forgot that or not. Totally influenced by the Arnolfini wedding. And this is the one of two works we'll see tonight that is influenced by the Arnolfini portraits that we saw, right? And it's a convex mirror with a man in a red turban, right? And you remember from the worksheet that's probably Van Eyck, the man in the red turban there. And there's a church outside the window, and he's got a book, and he's like this. Right, he's got in effect, he's got a cloth over his hands, and he's got his nose buried in it because it's a precious one, right? And she's just like a manhandling hers, and she's turning it back to front, and really not paying any attention to it. She's in it for cash, right? She's in it for money, and that's sort of the moralizing message. Now the question is there a moralizing message to Velázquez, right? Because it's a genre scene. Does it, 100 years later, does it maintain those traditions? We do know that the Spanish were heavy collectors of Flemish pictures. We'll talk more about that as we move our way through this, right? But they're huge collectors of Flemish pictures. And so is there some message here? And it seems maybe less moralizing, but at the same time, there probably is a message here. Because if we look there's three men passing water between them. Okay? I mean, that's the central theme, right? So the water seller is just this guy that walks around town selling water. But Velázquez sees in this everyday activity something with sort of greater symbolic weight, right? Because if you look at the three guys, look at the three heads, you can see that there are three different ages. That the man who's giving the water is the oldest one. And the one he's giving it to is the youngest one. And the one in the middle is sort of, young adult, right? And he's drinking it. So if we think about metaphors of water, water is life, right? The old give life back to the young. And the one in the middle is partaking in it, right? So the boy is receiving the gift of life from his elders, right? And the man in the middle is the man in the midst of life, right? The water of life and the three ages of man, right? This could easily be a theme that Velázquez is working with. Is it meant to be moralizing? Is it teaching us lessons? I think less of that, right? And when we look at 17th century genre scenes, at least from Spain, what we see is often they are significantly less moralizing. I think the Spanish leave that for the religious pictures because they love them so much. Now, with the water carrier of Seville, one of the things that Velázquez seems to be trying to do and this is a theme that will come up a couple times tonight, is he's showing off his talent. It's like we saw Durer do that with the Adam and Eve print, right? Where it's just going to knock it out of the park. This is the best thing I can possibly do. I'm going to put my name on it. I'm going to show you how to find me. You know, if you want to buy a print as good as this one, you ain't going to get it from anybody else, right? It's me. Here it is. Albert Durer, I live in Nuremberg, right? Velázquez is also, I think, using this as a demonstration piece. Not only is he showing us this incredible range of textures he's able to paint, a composition that's in basically two colors. You've done that studio exercise, probably in a color theory class. Paint with one color, black and white, right? That's it. That, dang. Right? Nailed it. So limited palette makes it even more sort of special that he could do this range within so little, right? And then also to find in this everyday scene something really sort of important for anybody. The idea of the water of life in the three ages of man. He really seems to be trying to demonstrate for himself or for somebody what is great about this himself as a painter, right? And what we're seeing ever since the Renaissance onward is this sort of rise in artistic sense of self-value, self-worth. And when we get to the 17th century, when we get to the Baroque period, we find a lot of artists are very, very interested in status, the status of the artist. Because artists had been, with some few exceptions, you know, your Titians, your Michelangelos, and your court painters, right? But for the most part, artists had been craftsmen, not really seen differently from, you know, guys who made chairs, shoes, right? Put glass in windows. You know, they were simple craftsmen. And there's an attempt after the Renaissance, and certainly strong in the 17th century, to elevate the status of the artist, that the artist is important, that the artist is a person who traffics in ideas, right? That he's a humanist scholar, as good as the rest of them, right? And Velázquez, I think, is moving us in that direction here. And what we'll see is, of course, it works for him because he does this on spec. He does this for himself. It's not a commissioned work of art, right? It wasn't somebody came to him and said, I want a genre scene. He just sort of made a genre scene and hoped he could sell it. And he turns out selling it to, remember, he's in Seville, right? Which is the major economic center of Spain. And he sells it to a man who knew him from when he was a kid, like a smallish enough town that you can track. His dad was an art teacher, and that put him in the right circles, you know. And that probably helped him be so good so young, right? Your dad's an artist, that helps. Mine wasn't, right? He ended up selling it to someone who got a job with the King of Spain. The King of Spain's court is in Madrid, right? And Velázquez sells this picture to a man who becomes, I think it's the king's theological advisor, something along those lines. Doesn't really matter, but a member of court, right? And so when he leaves Seville to go to Madrid, he takes this picture with him, right? Part of his private collection, off to Madrid to work for the King of Spain. The King of Spain sees it and says, oh my God, who's that? Right? Oh, it's this, you know, young painter back in Seville from my hometown. Get him. Bring him here. I want him to work for me. And Velázquez ended up, because of this picture, joining the court of the King of Spain. And he becomes, in 1521, I think it is, he becomes the official portrait painter to the King of Spain. Lives in the palace, right? Becomes a trusted confidant of the king for the next 40 years, right? This picture did it for him. So in other words, if he is trying to show off, it's sort of like a cover letter on your resume. You got to show off because otherwise nobody's going to hire you. Right? And it worked, right? It was his greatest letter of introduction. Well, our king was King Philip IV, or Felipe IV of Spain. And here's one of the earliest 3 or 4 portraits of Philip that Velázquez painted. It's a full-size portrait, maybe even slightly larger than full-size. And again, these Baroque ideas of engagement, right? Philip is looking right at us. I guess he should be as a portrait, they almost always do. But what's cool is he's got in his hand a letter that is a letter requesting audience with the king. So you are really part of this, you know? You are, you've come, you've brought your letter, and he said, sure, come on in. And he's taken off his gloves because, you know, leave them on if you're slimy, right? But no, we're on an equal level. And he looks directly at us, right? Again, Velázquez with another monochromatic picture, right? He does that so well. I once had a discussion with a young man at the time. He was went on to be an art dealer, but he was saying that for his money, Velázquez is maybe the best person that ever picked up a brush. And I'd certainly put him in the top 5 when it comes to sort of technical proficiency. We'll see this as we look at a couple of the Velázquez. And Philip was incredibly happy with him as a portrait painter. Now, Philip IV was a member of the Habsburg family. You may have heard of them. They're very, very prominent rulers in Europe from around the 15th century, end of the 15th century, all the way to the early part of the 20th century. It was the Austro-Habsburg dynasty, right? The Austro-Hungarian realm, governed by the Habsburgs, that fell as part of World War I. Right? So they're still strong, still ruling a significant portion of Europe all the way to the early 20th century. Right? At this point, they are kings of Spain and some related territories, as we'll find out. And they had consolidated their power by inbreeding, by marrying cousins to tighten up the connections. Because what we find in the 17th century is that most marriages are arranged, especially amongst the aristocracy, are arranged marriages specifically to consolidate power, to bring more money to the family. The idea of marrying for love is a kind of a 19th century concept. Didn't really get into full swing everywhere until the 20th century. And even then, there are some marriages that are obviously seem to be set up, if you look back at 20th century history. So the Habsburg family was notorious for sort of marrying pretty close to the bloodline, right? And had been doing so already at this point by about 150 years. And they got really, really ugly, right? I mean, the Habsburg nose, those lips, those jowls, right? The big, thick lips, the heavy chin, the long nose, the puffy face. Really homely group of people, the Habsburgs were, and remained this way through the centuries. And in addition to that, because of the inbreeding, a significant number of Philip's first children died, either in childbirth or as very, very young children, right? Through birth defects. So what does he like about Velázquez? He likes the fact that actually, despite all that, he still kind of looks okay. And in fact, there's an x-ray of this picture here, and you can see he's like, well, he's made his cheeks a little bit less chipmunk-like, you know? He's kind of cleaned them up a bit. His eye sockets don't look as deeply embedded, you know? And so under the x-ray, it's like, you know, you can see Phil going, I don't look that ugly, and you go like, yeah, yes, you do. But he's under his breath, he would say, yes, you do. But you're right, your cheeks aren't that big, and clean it up a little bit, you know, and lighten up the eyes. And this, I think, was part of what made Velázquez Philip's favorite painter, right? Was his ability to flatter the sitters. Obviously there were other reasons, but that certainly does play into it, right? Now, the most famous Velázquez painting is a painting of Philip's daughter, the Infanta Margarita, who's in the middle here. For some reason, little Margarita did not inherit his looks, and some of his other daughters did, right? She's just as cute as a button, and she was his favorite child. Part of that became because he had 8 children by 2 different wives before Margarita, and all but one of them had died. So when Margarita is born, she's one of 2 surviving children out of 9. Right? Again, that's the kind of Habsburg curse. And Velázquez paints her as a bit of a group portrait. where she appears in this room in the palace surrounded by her entourage. Meninas means ladies in waiting, right? So the picture is the ladies in waiting. It's Margarita surrounded by her friends, her entertainers, her chaperones, the people in waiting for the young princess. Right? It was commissioned by Philip IV to hang in his office. I mean, I don't think he kept a desk like I do in my office, but the idea is that he would be sitting across from it and would look out, and it's a fairly large picture, and like 8 or 9 feet tall, and he would see this on the far wall, right? So it was for his office, something he would see every day. And it's a simple portrait commission, we think, that Velázquez has given, or Philip has given to Velázquez, a simple portrait commission. And Velázquez has taken that opportunity and done something incredibly special with it. He's trying to enliven the portrait. And we'll see a lot of artists in the 17th century trying to do this, to take a genre and make it more lively. That fits perfectly with the Baroque idea, right? To make it more lively. Instead of giving us a posed portrait. I mean, Velázquez has already tried to do that here, right? Tried to enliven the portrait, to make it look like it's an interchange between him and you, right? Oh, I'm so glad you came. Right? And I've got your letter right here. So it's enlivening a bit. But this goes even a step further because it makes it look as if it's not posed. It makes it look as if he sort of captured a snapshot of a moment, as if they're sitting around playing and he's capturing them at the moment they're playing. Because that's Velázquez on the left, right? Painting, in the act of painting. So he's included himself with the group. So the man standing with the mustache, with that really great sort of silent film villain mustache, right? That's the self-portrait of the painter there. You see he's in the act of painting this monster canvas here. And it's almost as if he's looking at a mirror where you are to paint them, you know? But they're just sort of hanging out in his studio, and it makes him gives him that much more status, right? He's a member of court. And the kids are hanging there, and whatever he happens to be painting, whether it's them or not, there's just a bunch of people hanging around, and he's a healthy member of the group, right? He turns it into sort of just something that appears unposed, right? Not that they're sitting there, okay, you gotta stand there, hold that, wait right there. He makes it look instantaneous, right? So there's a close-up of little Margarita, and she's just cute as a button. And those are the two ladies in waiting, right? When we talk about Las Meninas, we really are talking about these two. And what they're doing is they're having a little tea service. So the one on the left is kneeling down to her and says, hey, you want? And she's got a little bottle of tea on a nifty little silver tray, right? And little Margarita's kind of reaching forward, and she's sort of taking a moment to look at us, right? The other one right behind her is there also to play tea time, right? With little Margarita. And as we look at this detail, we can see all the other people around it, but we can also see this really cool detail in the back, right? Because right behind her head is a mirror on the wall in the back. And who should that be in the mirror but Philip IV, standing there, right? Two people in the mirror there with his second wife, the mother of little Margarita, Mariana of Austria. Right? So he's taking a moment now to look back into the mirror. And so you imagine now when Philip is watching this, right? So Faisal, you're Philip now. You look up, and you see yourself in the mirror looking back at you, right? That adds that sense of engagement of the picture, right? And I'm pointing you out because you're close enough to see it. The girls wouldn't see themselves in Philip, right? Maybe in Mariana, his wife. I don't know if you can tell with the blurred out image in the background, but Mariana is a relative. She's a Habsburg as well, and she shares his basic facial features. I think of a detail of her coming up, right? But she's okay. Mariana is his second wife and his niece. Yeah, right? It's just creepy. The Habsburg bloodline. Okay. Now, obviously, this should remind you. I was going to ask you, but we've already brought it up, right? This should remind you of the Arnolfini wedding, right? The Arnolfini and his bride, where we see people sort of gathered casually in a room as a portrait, and then we look behind them, and there's a mirror that reflects where we are, right? And we see people in the mirror. Velázquez has taken a step further, right? He sees the actual patron of the work looking at it, rather than just two figures, one of whom may be the artist, right? He takes that a step further. This painting was actually in Spain at the time that Velázquez painted this. It passed through a number of collections before it wound up in London, where it is today, and it was in the Spanish Royal Collection. So it's a work of art that Velázquez actually had access to. Now you'll notice that Margarita is one of 6 figures who look directly at us, right? One of them we see here is a court dwarf. This is the era when court members, when kings would keep dwarves as entertainers at court. So our woman on the right is a court entertainer. She is a dwarf, and she has probably a relative as well. The little boy in red is also another court dwarf. They weren't very, what do you want to say, woke, right? They didn't quite understand that, humans shouldn't be used as goofy entertainment because they're built differently. My wife last night, while I was doing some work, put on some Jackass, Best of Jackass, and I kept thinking of Wee Man in Jackass. It's like we're not that much better. Mini-Me in the Mike Myers movies is not that much better, but nonetheless, they were a little bit more overt with sort of keeping the dwarves around as court entertainment. Every book I've read on this misses something. They always say the little boy is kicking the dog, but that little boy is not kicking that dog. That little boy is giving it a little butt scratch, right? Look at the look of that dog's face. That is just like heaven. And if you ever get a dog and you sort of scratch right between its haunches on its back like that, it will push against your foot. And they just love that. It's one of the 2 or 3 places on a dog. They're behind the ears if you want a dog to just chill. And that dog couldn't be happier. He's not going anywhere, right? Because the little boy is not kicking him, but he's sort of rubbing his back. And again, there's this sense of touch, right? How much the Baroque period, artists in the Baroque period, love to make pictures that conjure up associations with all 5 of your senses. And our little boy is doing exactly that. Most obviously, one of the figures who looks at us is Velázquez, and that kind of conjures up this question about what's going on in the picture. This has always been a sort of mysterious and fascinating picture for people, because if Philip looks and sees himself here, that means Velázquez is looking at Philip, right? So again, if I said, you're Philip and I'm Velázquez, and if you think about it, if that's the case, and he's looking at you like this, then he's probably painting Philip. Wouldn't that make more sense? And the kids are just sort of hanging out there, right? Rather than looking in a mirror to paint what we're seeing. But it remains this sort of interesting thing, because Velázquez is creating a world that alludes to all sorts of things but doesn't explain any of them for us, right? It really is a theme of this picture is about the artist creating. How the artist can, in fact, create a world that is an extension of our world, but is weird that way, right? There are paintings on the back wall, and we can actually identify these, right? There are paintings from the Royal Collection. We know what room this is. This is the room that Velázquez used as his studio in the Royal Palace. And we've gone back, the academic community, has gone back and has looked at these pictures that are hidden in shadow and tried to figure out which pictures there are. And we go back to the Royal Collection and we can find them, right? That he's actually copied images from the Royal Collection onto the walls in the background. And all of these pictures are about artists, not just visual artists, but musicians, right, who challenge the gods, who say that they can do what the gods do better. So this is Pan and Apollo, right? And Pan tells Apollo that he can play the pipes better than Apollo. He challenges him to a pipe duel, right? Playing the pipes. And of course he's going to lose, right? Because no one can do it better than the gods. But both pictures have this theme of artists who think they're as good as the gods, right? Who are just that good to think that. And they add to the theme that while, Philip asks for a portrait of his daughter, he ends up giving this portrait that's really as much about Velázquez as it is about the daughter. And that part that's about Velázquez is kind of picked up with this mirror. Again, I think this is such an amazing piece of art. Right, so there's Philip and Mariana, his wife, in the mirror. I once read this, and I had to check it to see it was true, that this in physics, in a mirror, do you know the properties of mirrors? It's true that anytime, if you were to take a Sharpie and draw, so you get a mirror and you see your reflection, and you draw the size of your head. Wherever that mirror is, it's going to be half the size of you. I don't know how that works, but it does. I know, and it says, but do it. Go home and do it, right? It's half the size of what it reflects. Okay? If you double Philip and Mariana, where are they? Where should they be? Not where Faisal is, but about where Margarita is. They're about the same size as Velázquez, right? Because they're about half the size of Velázquez. So the mirror reflection is skewed somehow, right? It's either too big if they're sitting outside the picture, or if they're inside the picture, they're not there. Unless they're here. Unless they're on the canvas and the mirror isn't direct, isn't flat on the wall. And that's what some people think, is that perhaps the mirror reflects a painting that Velázquez did of the king and his wife. And part of the evidence for that is that in the mirror there's this bit of red fabric that's pulled back behind them, theatrical, as if they're coming out from behind a curtain. And that's a normal thing we see in portraits in the 17th century. We see it all the time. Here's a life-size portrait of Mariana. Right? So what's Velázquez painting? Right? Is he looking at a mirror out here to paint her? Does the mirror there reflect the painting? Or does it reflect the person who's looking? We don't know. There's all this mystery. He's created this work. Right? His creation has more possibility than the real world. It rivals the real world. And that's picked up with the paintings in the background. This is a painting about the status of a painter. Right? And that's kind of a new idea. Michelangelo may have put himself in the Last Judgment, but he was being judged by Jesus. And he'd been skinned alive. It wasn't necessarily about his status. And this is a new way of looking at artistic status. And then look at the size of that canvas that he's painting. It's so big you can't even put it on the crossbar on the bottom, right? It rests on the ground, leaning up against the easel. It's the same size as the real picture, right? Just to give you a sense of scale, right? Here's the Prado in Madrid. And I've never been. I want to go, but I hate crowds, so I don't know, anymore. I've been spoiled by D.C. There's never crowds at the Art Museum in D.C. But the painting in the painting is about the size of the painting, if that makes sense. And Velázquez is playing with this idea about you don't know what he's painting. Whether he's painting them by looking into a mirror, or whether he's painting the people we see in the mirror. Right? It's just a fascinating sort of mind game that he's playing. And with that in mind, I want to look a little closer at how Velázquez paints, because, like I said earlier, he's one of the greatest painters that ever picked up a brush. He's learned some things about painting from people like Titian. The idea of not blending your brush strokes, making it become almost abstract as you get close. Right? So there's her little hand on the little teapot. And how at certain points, what looks like a well-defined, tightly drawn sleeve is nothing but just a few strokes. This is, Velázquez the minimalist. Velázquez who can work in one color, right? Can get things done with just a few strokes. And the more you look at it, the more you see he's just leaving it as if he's... And it makes it look so freaking easy, and it's not. Because it's so sure, right? And so for the sleeve of the Menina, right, coming down, it looks as if it's just like, yep, here it is. I know exactly what I'm doing here. And it's infuriating. It's so easy looking, right? There are certain artists that are this way. There are people like, when you watch, I don't know. When I was a kid, I listened to a lot of rock and roll, and I saw Led Zeppelin at the Seattle Kingdom at the time. And, Jimmy Page would make a guitar solo look like nothing, right? Or there was this guitarist for a punk band named X, Billy Zoom, who would sit there and he would talk to the audience while he's playing these incredible licks, firing up, and not even looking in his hands, and you just go like, whatever. Velázquez is kind of doing the same thing, right? And he uses the range of brushstrokes, and this is this other incredible thing. Notice how the paint on the sleeve, either of the sleeves, or even the little dish, is handled differently than the paint on the Menina's hands, especially that one in the background. It's almost like it's moving, because he doesn't really have a firm edge to anything. It's blurred out. And he doesn't know photography, right? First photographs are like 1820 or something, right? He has no idea about blurred photography. But he understands that if you play with the resolution of the brushstroke, you can focus a viewer's attention. Because if I'm not looking at Minor, if I'm looking at Sophia, Minor's still here and I can still see her, but she's blurry. She's not in focus until I do this, right? And if I'm looking at you and talking to you, then you're the focus, and even Madison is out of it, right? And Velázquez kind of understands that about vision and uses his brushstrokes so that what he wants you to look at, what he wants you to focus on, is what's most sharply painted. And in this case, it's the face of little Margarita, and even to a certain degree, some of what Velázquez is doing here. He's really fantastic with his ability and his range of brushstrokes. And then another nice detail, right? The sleeve of the other Menina, where you can see, look, this is incredible. This looks like a late 19th century painting here, with this little bit of haiku, a little bit of calligraphy with the pen, with the brush there to give you the highlights on that. And these are just little flecks of paint torn down, and no attempt whatsoever to blend them, right, from the highlight to the shadow. But when you get away, he understands that your eye will do it. And those will become those flecks of light that glint off of a shinier satin fabric. There's a Margarita's corsage, right? Where you can see the range of, some of them are thick, right? Glumps of yellow here and there. But some of them are sort of thin washes and wipes, right? And it almost sort of blends away to like a 20th century abstract painting. As we get in close, because Velázquez is so adept with the brush. He's so good about getting in it and just sort of shifting things around. We have a Velázquez. We have one Velázquez at the National Gallery. It's unfinished, right? We don't have a good one, unfortunately. But if you ever have the chance to see one live, don't pass it up. He really is a fantastic painter. Now, again, a lot of this he learned from looking around. His patron, Philip, owned a ton of Titians. Titian had been the court painter to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the great-grandfather of Philip IV, right? And inherited all these works from his great-great-great-grandfather. So around the palace, there are Titians everywhere. And Velázquez is a huge fan. He makes copies of them as well. And that idea of open brushwork that suggests texture, but also shows the artist at work. That's an idea he got out of Titian, and he's amplifying it. Now we're going to shift our focus away from Spain and over to Flanders. right back to the Netherlands, where we had left off, the land of Van Eyck in the 15th century and Bruegel in the 16th century, right? And this makes sense to shift here now for a couple of different reasons. Politically, there is a link between Flanders and Spain in the 17th century. Around 1500, the great-grandson of Jan van Eyck's patron. Remember Van Eyck's patron, Philip the Good, right? Another Philip. His great-grandson had married into the Habsburg family. Right? He had married the daughter of the King of Spain. Her name was Joanna the Mad, because she actually went crazy. Right? So he marries into the Habsburg family. Again, these court marriages are almost always to build dynasty, never really for love. That meant that there was a family connection between the leaders of the Low Countries, the leaders of Flanders, and the kings of Spain. And by the middle of the 16th century, the rulers of Flanders had abandoned Flanders. They had left the Low Countries, and they were governing the Low Countries from Madrid. They're governing it from Spain. And it's for this reason we refer to it as the Spanish Netherlands. Right? They are separated by France, separated by a significant amount of territory, but they are governed by the kings of Spain by the middle of the 16th century. By Bruegel's time, right, this led to war. Outright rebellion and war. In 1566, after the region of Flanders had gone Protestant, or mostly Protestant, right, there was an outbreak of what is called iconoclasm. That is the destruction of religious images. Icon means image, clasm, destruction. Right? Iconoclasm in the Low Countries. Huge outbreak, a lot of people going into churches, tearing down statues, carting off paintings. In this print, we see some of that happening. Some destroyed statues in the foreground, people walking out the door with paintings, trying to knock sculptures off the buildings, destroying imagery. Right? And this all comes from the Bible. You shall make no images. Right? So get rid of them. Iconoclasm. And the King of Spain at that point decides to send in troops. King Philip II of Spain. Now he is the great-grandfather of Philip IV, who we just looked at. And he's like the 5th great-grandson of Philip the Good, the Knight's patron. Again, not very good with the names, right? Philip's and Charles. That's what they're like, right? Philip II in Madrid unleashes his troops to stop the iconoclasm. The people of the Low Countries call it the Spanish Fury, because they are incredibly heavy-handed, slaughtering tens of thousands of people. And this leads to an open outbreak of rebellion and war, where the people of the Low Countries do not they don't like being ruled by someone from Spain. They put up with it before this because they were born in the Low Countries, they just had moved there. But Philip II was born in Spain. And I think he'd come to the Low Countries once, and that was to have a little tour around the towns after he got his crown, just to sort of see what his territories looked like. He went back to Spain, that was it. Right? Never came back. So they didn't like being ruled by a foreigner. It kind of sounds weird, right? Doesn't even speak the language. Rules by a bunch of governors that he appoints. Don't like that. They don't like the fact that he's Catholic and pushing Catholicism on them. Many of them are Protestants. And they certainly don't like this heavy-handed military stopping of the uprisings. Okay? And this leads in 1568 to outright war. Oh, sorry about that. referred to as the 80 Years' War. The 80 Years' War is between the Spanish Netherlands on the one hand and the United Provinces, or Holland, on the other. What happened was, after the Spanish Fury, all of the Catholics stayed in the Spanish Netherlands, and all the Protestants fled to Holland. Now, there were a few places where you could practice Catholicism in Holland, but for the most part, it's Protestant. Right? And the Spanish Netherlands remains Catholic. At one point, this whole area belonged to Spain, right? And beginning in 1568, we have a war of independence for the Dutch to the north against Spanish control. It will take much longer for the South to wrest itself away from Spanish control. Okay? So beginning in 1568, there is a war. That means all the way to 1648, through most of Velázquez's lifetime, war is going on with his king, right? Is fighting an ongoing war. And it's not like they're fighting every single day, but it's close to that, you know? There's always something bad happening, always something bad going on. So the time that Bruegel's painting, we were running our way up to the war. And many of his works of art reflect sort of the turmoil of the time. Okay. So as we look at the Spanish Netherlands, we have to keep in mind, on one hand, that while we're talking about Flemish art, Flanders, we're going to be talking about a region that's ruled by Spain, and in open military conflict with the Dutch to the north. Okay? Keep that in the back of your minds. The early part of the 17th century is an era of the most war-torn eras of all of European history, right? Rivals the 40s. Now, our prominent artist in Flanders in the 17th century is Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens. Too bad Alyssa's not here. This is her artist today. And he's in the city of Antwerp, which we looked at before when we talked about genre scenes, when we talked about Bruegel. It was the economic center of Europe, economic center of the Low Countries. And this is where Rubens set up shop because it's a great place for an artist to work, where there's a place with lots of money. Now, as an artist in the north, he had decided to go to Italy just to travel, just to see the art that's in Italy. And he spends about 10 years working in Italy. 1600 to 1610, Rubens is in Italy, pursuing an artistic career there. Part of that might have been inspired by the war, right? Go somewhere else where it's a little bit more peaceful, away from the front. Antwerp is very, very close to the front, right? He goes down not only to see the art, but also to pursue a career. And our picture here on the left, not that big, about like yay, right? Was painted while he was in Italy. Let's see what I got coming up here. This means that he's in Italy at the exact same time that Caravaggio is painting, right? He goes there when Caravaggio is alive. And what's interesting, as we looked at Caravaggio, we talked about the fact that it was hard to escape his influence, right? We saw Orazio and Artemisia Gentileschi, right? We saw Giuseppe de Ribera, even Velázquez, secondhand, picking up the influence of Caravaggio. It was very difficult to escape the influence of Caravaggio. Brown tonality, theatrical highlighting, darkened backgrounds, right? But Rubens is one of the few artists who isn't influenced by Caravaggio. He goes to Italy while Caravaggio is alive, while Caravaggio's paintings are the newest, coolest thing out there, and he comes away unscathed. He's not at all interested in that kind of painting. He is interested in his own sort of take on what it means to be a Baroque painter. And if Baroque art is dramatic, right? And I think if anything else, that's the one thing. Baroque art is highly dramatic. We've seen this in every work we've looked at. Even things that are standing still have a certain drama to them. If Baroque art is dramatic, Rubens is about as Baroque as you can get. He rivals Caravaggio for the most Baroque of the Baroque artists. One of the things he's doing while he's in Italy is he's looking all over the place. I think part of the reason he's not interested in Caravaggio is he's down there and he's going, oh, wait a second, there's Leonardo da Vinci. There was this wonderful mural that Leonardo had done in the town hall of Florence, since been destroyed, and Rubens makes a copy of it. Right? And he's interested in these swirling, dramatic, action-packed figures. That's where Rubens's Baroque goes, is in the direction of action and drama. And as we look closely at this picture, we see nothing but flailing, nothing but drama. And while Caravaggio had a huge impact on a lot of artists early in the 17th century, right? We've seen a ton so far. It was Rubens who had an impact on all of that theatrical drama that we saw from people like Bernini or Gaudi, right? Working in a sort of expansive ceiling with everything swirling around. That's Rubens, right? So he was there for 10 years. He was pretty young when he went. He was like 20 when he went down there, right? And he left a number of works behind. Some altarpieces, right? Some works that were in private collections. Those seem to have been the works that inspired this highly theatrical, later Baroque style. So we can argue that you're going to put your money on, make an argument for who's the most influential Baroque painter, right? And you'd be right in saying Caravaggio, but you'd also be right if you said Rubens, right? Because Rubens gives us a different approach to high drama. In this case, it's the story of, who is it? He's the son of Apollo, Phaeton is. And it's kind of a funny story if you tell it right. Phaeton was told, as Apollo's son, the legend of Apollo for the Romans and the Greeks, right, is that the sun that we see in the sky is a chariot that's being driven by the sun god Apollo, right? And usually with 4 horses drawing it, right? And it just glows because he's the sun god. And that's how the sun moves across the sky, is that Apollo's driving the chariot across the sky, okay? And you can't see it because he's a god. That's the truth. Phaeton is his son, and this is where it's kind of, he says, you don't get to drive the car, right? It's like Ferris Bueller's friend, right? You don't get to touch the car. Do what you want, but don't get the car. And then he leaves it in the garage, so to speak, right? And lo and behold, Phaeton gets in the chariot and tries to drive it, right? And he goes up in the sky, and of course he doesn't know how to handle it because it's a race car, right? And as he goes up in the sky, he ends up, right, wrecking Dad's car and falling from the sky, right? And so that's exactly what Rubens shows us here, is that moment of high drama when he wrecks it, right? When the chariot now kicks Phaeton out and he's going to fall down to earth, which we see at the very bottom, right, from the heavens. And again, high drama, right? The moment of transition from driving the chariot to blasting, blasting everything apart, right? And again, this just sea of figures in action everywhere we look. In 1609, Rubens' mom died, and he gets a message, or she's dying, and she'd been a widow for a very, very long time, right? His dad had passed away back in the 16th century, and he gets a message down in Italy, your mom's dying, come back, and of course he is, because he's a good son, and he's going to come back and attend to his mother as she's dying, and he ends up staying, right? He brings him back from Italy. And he brings with him this highly dramatic style that he'd been developing. this highly Baroque interest in drama. So here, instead of an image of the crucifixion where Christ is just hanging there on the cross, Rubens gives us a different moment in the story where the Roman soldiers and their servants are raising the cross, right? Going to put it upright into the post hole that they've dug, and Christ will be hanging there. And that's the central panel. We see the Roman soldier on the left with a bunch of heavily muscled men lifting up Jesus on the cross. He looks towards heaven for his salvation. On the left, we see the Virgin Mary and John, St. John. They're always there. You'll notice in tradition she's fainting, right? And her skin is pretty pale, right? John tenderly has his hand on hers. Again, the sense of touch, right? On the way to Calvary, the mountain, Jesus sees women of Jerusalem weeping, and he says, "Mothers of Jerusalem, don't weep for me." And those are the figures in the lower left corner. And can you tell what's going on the right? Christ was crucified between two thieves, and there are more of the Roman troops there dictating that the other two thieves be nailed to the cross, right? But Christ is put up first. So that extends the story on either side. But the focus, of course, is on the raising of the cross. And it's this amazing diagonal that runs from the lower right corner of the center panel up to the upper left and back and into the composition that sort of sweeps us in with it, right? It's absolutely massive, right? It's amazingly huge, almost like 20 feet tall. And it's typical for the Baroque to have these pictures that have that kind of scale. And in part, that's the thing that says, you have to engage with this. It's kind of hard to turn your back on a picture this big when you walk past it. And so it's still in the cathedral in Antwerp where it was originally commissioned to go. And I think it originally had a predella on the bottom and maybe some stuff on the top, and that's been lost. But this gives you now a sense of scale, right? Here in the classroom, everything's the same size. Rubens wants us to live this. He wants us to immerse ourselves in it, to become part of it. And he has all these tricks where he reaches out to us to inspire us to engage. He does this a lot. Puts an animal in the corner that turns and looks at you, right? It's drooling, right, from its reign. But it just becomes sort of difficult to not engage with because an animal's sort of like seeing and is reacting to you, right? So you become part of this. And at the same time, it becomes part of this idea that it's noise, that it's sound that we're looking at as well. Clomping his hoofs, whinnying, chomping at the bit. You can hear this picture. You can hear the tumult and the shouts of the Romans, the horse behind that arm, right, at the top there. In the center panel, he gives us a spaniel in the corner, right, also barking, right in the foreground. So again, we're sort of meant to hear this picture, right? To use more than our sense of sight, to engage us as much as he can. The figure in the foreground looks like it leans out toward us, almost like it leans out of the picture. And it establishes this theme that Rubens is working with, which is, look at the extraordinary physique of these guys. Look at the size of those legs. They're not fat, right? They are just ripping. They're steroid. They're World Wrestling Federation, only with less gut. I mean, they are. They're not linebackers, right? They're more like soccer players or something, or rugby players, right? They are extraordinarily strong, and that's part of what Rubens, I think, wants us to understand about this, because I counted a good 8 people needed to lift the cross. Why do you need so many people to lift the cross? It's just one guy. Couldn't 2 or 3 do it? And Rubens wants to enhance the sense of activity, action on the one hand, but I think there's a theological idea here. For Christians, Christ is carrying the weight of the world. He is carrying the sins of mankind. And in order to lift that, it's not me, guys who are built like me, who don't work weights many, many hours, many, many days a week, right? These guys do, and you need someone like that to lift the weight of the world, right? And so Christ is coming up this way, and you get the sense of it rocking its way forward as it moves toward us. And all of these people are just extraordinarily muscular, right, as they help to raise Christ. And it also ties into this other element, which is, again, we've talked about sound, but what about touch, right? How important touch is in this picture. The figure on the right with the turban reaching up to Christ's hip. You'll notice that he's put the rag between his fingers and the hip. I think it's kind of an important thing. It would be a little too creepy if he was sort of grabbing him by the hip right there, right? And he understands this is the body of Christ. To Christians, the body of Christ is a very holy thing. Not everybody gets to touch that. And the henchman in red on the right is one that doesn't quite get to touch it. But notice his blood, right? Jesus' blood around the robe there, right around his fingers. And then this monster on the left with almost like demon ears and a bald head. What does bald head always mean, right, in imagery? They're bad guys, right? Hellraiser, Think of that the first Indiana Jones movie has the fist fight with the Nazi on the tarmac, and the plane is spinning around. He's a bad guy. He's worse than anybody else, right? He's one who gets at the very end. This is meant to be a bad guy, right? He's tormenting the Savior. And Rubens wants us to understand that, so he gives him sort of, we presume to be ugly features, and we can still get that even though we don't see his face full on. And he's bald, and his head is sort of deformed. Look at the back of that skull. And his skin is darker than Jesus's. That also means the same thing, right? Ruddy skin tormentor. And Jesus is bleeding because of them, and his skin is pure and soft, but also pretty hunky, right? I mean, if Jesus is going to carry the weight of the world, he'd better be doing weights as well. You know what I mean? And everybody in Rubens's world has this sort of physicality that's just absolutely extraordinary. Right? Part of this is that he'd been looking at a lot of art when he went down to Rome, and there's a very, very famous sculpture from the 1st century A.D. About the guy that tried to warn the people of Troy that horse was a bad idea. Don't accept gifts from strangers. Yeah? And he was devoured by sea monsters because the gods wanted them to take the gift. Laocoon, right? He's this priest from Troy. And it was unearthed during Michelangelo's lifetime. Michelangelo was there when this was dug up, right? And when Rubens goes to Italy, he goes to Rome, and he goes and sees it. He makes sketches after it, right? There are about 4 or 5 different sketches he made of the body of the Laocoon and his son. And you can see that Jesus' body is a sort of variation on this, right? Not a line-for-line copy, but obviously the width, the breadth, the heft of this figure shows his adaptation of all the things he'd been seeing when he was in Rome. Amid the all of the tormentors is the centurion, and we've seen him before, Saint Longinus, right? The image that we saw before of him, we saw in this little Master of Saint Veronica picture, where remember he's on the left, dressed much more finely, and the legend is that he was blind, right? And didn't realize who he was tormenting, and he pierced Christ's side with the lance, and as the blood run down and got on his hands, and he could see, right? Miraculously could see. And at that point converted and became a follower of Christ, because then he realized the horror of what he'd done, right? And in the St. Veronica piece, we saw how he looks somewhat blind, but at the same time, it looks as if he's praying, and blood is streaming down everywhere, and there's his lance right next to him. This is meant to be St. Longinus there as well. And the question is whether he's staring in blindness or is staring in immediate awareness. But the fascinating thing is those features, it's Rubens. That face is Rubens' face. That's a self-portrait. And he's included himself here in the same way he wants us to include ourselves here. Right? He's taking part. Now, how do you take part in the crucifixion of Christ? Right? Very difficult thing to do. If you're a believer, you don't want to be somebody who was responsible for the death of Christ. So, who's better than St. Longinus? Because he was doing it because he was blind. And once the sight came, he realized that that was the wrong thing to do, and he became a follower of Christ, became an ardent follower of Christ. Right? So Rubens puts himself into the one figure here who's got some hope. Right? The one figure here who understands fully what's going on. And we'll end with this. We had talked before when we looked at Bernini, how he had used this new form of prayer that St. Ignatius Loyola had come up with in the 16th century. A way to engage the reader with the things they're reading, right? So when you read it, your prayer book, right, you should imagine that you're there. That you should imagine the sounds and the sights and the smells, right? The tastes. Right? You should imagine all of that so that when you're engaged with your devotions, you are truly engaged with your devotions, not like the money changer's wife. Right? These were called the spiritual exercises, and they were published. There was a regimen that you would go through over a number of weeks that would increase your ability to immerse yourself and imagine these things and have visions. Right? Rubens was an active participant in this. He did this all the time. Right? He was very, very devout. And he's done it with this picture. Right? He's imagined himself right into the thick of it. Right? He's put himself there so that he can hear it, so that he can smell it, so that he can taste it. Right? As well as just see it. And he puts himself at that amazing moment of change, of immediate awareness. Right? Rubens is one of the reasons I started studying art history. I was a big Rubens fan when I was where you guys are. We've got one more Rubens to look at here in the National Gallery. We'll pick that up on Thursday when we meet again and move ahead with this. We're also going to be able to get through the rest of Flanders and move on to Holland at this point. I'm trying to shorten up all the things I want to say about these, whatever it may seem, and get us so that we can get closer and closer to the modern period. So, you've got some due dates coming up. There's a new worksheet out. I sent you an email today about that for worksheet number 9, with plenty of time to get that done. And it's a fairly short one as well. There's one 5-minute video and a couple of short essays on it, right? You've got your bibliographies back, and I'll be grading your other worksheets next. I will see you guys on Thursday.